Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Before we begin, we want to cover a few housekeeping items. To the right of your screen, there are multiple application engagement tools that you can use throughout the presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the Q&A engagement tool. When submitting a question, please note that you do have the option to stay anonymous. Underneath the Q&A application is the polling tab. Here, polling questions will be launched and you will submit your answer until the polling question closes. If the polling tab is collapsed, a banner followed by a red dot will appear to notify you that a polling question has been launched. Today's webinar offers 1 CPE credit. To obtain the full amount of credit, you must answer 3 polling questions throughout the session. Qualified attendees will receive their CPE credit in 4 to 5 weeks. To find additional session documents, click Details at the bottom of your screen. Then click View Full Session Details. Here you can find session-related content to download such as PowerPoint slides, relevant documents, and more. As a reminder, this presentation is being recorded for replay purposes. This recording can be found in the Attendee Hub and will be available as an on-demand video an hour after the webinar has concluded. Lastly, don't forget to take our post-event survey. This can be found at the homepage of the Attendee Hub. Now, let's pass it over to today's speakers.
Good morning or afternoon, wherever you may be today. I'm so glad that so many of you could take the time today to join us to discuss and learn about the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act represents one of the largest incentive-based programs for clean energy projects that we've seen in years. And for the first time, makes it available to local governments for those incentives. We're going to be focusing today on the public sector, even though the IRA has many more aspects and funding opportunities in it, and how local government can take advantage of these funding opportunities for their clean energy projects. We have a great group of speakers here today from Baker Tilly Municipal Advisors. My name is Doug Baldessarian. I'm a partner here at Baker Tilly, and I've been working for about 22 years now with utilities, for the most part, in cities and towns to finance their capital projects in the most advantageous way that they can. Here more recently, I've worked extensively with the American Rescue Plan and Infrastructure Act, advising clients on how to take advantage of those funds, how to use those funds, etc. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Dave Erdman to introduce himself. He is on. Seems like he is not. Dave Erdman is a managing director with Baker Tilly, and he hopefully will get on here soon. And I'll turn it over now to Gideon Grabman.
Hi, this is Gideon Grabman. I'm a managing director and help lead our energy and infrastructure group within Baker Tilly and Baker Tilly Capital. Our team helps clients specifically with energy and energy infrastructure related projects and helps them with development and with project finance and really helps our clients both identify and capture all the different manner of incentives-based financing that's available to them for energy projects. The Inflation Reduction Act is a tremendous opportunity with a wide set of new and existing incentives that are now available for public sector clients that previously were not. And so I'm happy to talk today on this webinar and answer questions.
Great. Thanks, Gideon. So at this point, we'll move on talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law about 2 months ago on August 16, 2022. This is an extensive act bill that includes 728 pages of technical reading, which many of us here have read the entire act in order to be ready to help our clients and present here today. So the act includes $738 billion of total funding. $499 billion of that funding is for new spending and tax credit incentives for clean energy projects, much of it. So where's the balance go? The $238 billion that's not included here, and that is anticipated to reduce the deficit over in the coming years. So, and all this the dollar amounts here and the funding discussed on this slide is for the Congressional Budget Office update. So what's the breakdown of the $499 billion of available funding? As you can see, by far the largest portion of that funding is for clean electricity tax credits. The next largest pieces are for health expenditures. And then, as you can see, 8% of the funding is for air pollution, hazardous materials, transportation infrastructure, 7% for individual clean energy incentives, another 7% for manufacturing tax credits. As we discussed, this is an all for public sector. There certainly is incentives for manufacturing and other entities. 7% for clean fuel and vehicle tax credits, 7% for conservation, rural development, forestry, 5% for building efficiency, electrification, transmission, Department of Energy grants and loans, and 4% for energy and climate spending. All total, if you total the energy portion, energy and climate initiatives portion of this funding, 78% is for energy and climate initiatives, $391 billion. And much of this funding is for is available to public entities at this point, which is really the most exciting part of this. So aside from the tax credit incentives that we're going to discuss here in a little bit, what is the relevant loan and grant funding available to the public sector? And so we've looked over the bill, and we've pulled out the pieces that we believe that are available for the public sector to take advantage of from direct funding, loans, and grants. And $1 billion is for rural development funding for electric loans for renewable energy. It's important to say that 50% of this may be forgiven according to the legislation. And this is to provide and storage for electricity. I think this is important for a lot of our smaller communities and utilities to be able to get low interest financing or possible grant funding for their projects, where it might be certainly more expensive to go into the capital markets to get funding. And we all know that the interest rates have gone up significantly here in the past year, and if we're able to take advantage of low interest funding, that certainly will help the cost benefit of your project. $9.7 billion for United States Rural Development Assistance for Rural Electric Cooperatives. And this is to achieve the greatest reduction in greenhouse gas, according to the legislation. $1 billion is available to state, local, tribal, not-for-profits for zero building energy code adoption. So if you want to move forward with some energy code adoption, there's funding available for that. There's $2 billion for electric transmission facilities and financing. We all know the Infrastructure Act provided extensive funding for electric transmission grids and other electric projects, and this provides additional funding. $760 million for siting of interstate electricity transmission lines. There's $1 billion for state and local grants and rebates to replace vehicles with zero emission vehicles. Now these are larger vehicles. They're buses, trash trucks, street sweepers, other commercial vehicles, larger commercial vehicles, but there's $1 billion for that. There's $2.6 billion for climate resistance for coastal communities. $3 billion to reduce air pollution at ports. There's $7 billion for greenhouse gas reduction fund, and this is for low-income areas to deploy zero-emission technology. So there's significant funding there. There's $250 million to develop your greenhouse gas reduction plan, and another $4.75 billion to implement those plans. There's $3 billion for environmental justice block grants to reduce pollution, and this is for monitoring, prevention, and remediation of pollution. There's $3.155 billion neighborhood access and equity grant. Now this is to improve walkability, safety, and affordable transportation access for disadvantaged and underserved communities. There's $550 million of Bureau Reclamation domestic water supply projects, $4 billion for drought mitigation. We all know, we've all heard about the drought issues that are out west, and this bill provides funding to help with those issues. And there's $411 million for tribal and Hawaiian climate resistance. So you can see that much of this funding is to reduce the carbon footprint and reduce, implement the greenhouse reduction plans from the administration, and it's all available to public entities. So, I think it's really difficult if I was sitting in a city or town seat, running a city or town, say I was a mayor, that'd be difficult anyways. But how do you wrap your brain around all the funding that's out there right now, from the Infrastructure Act to the American Rescue Plan to now the Inflation Reduction Act, and how do you attempt to get the most funding you can for your community to better your community? And I think that's where assistance from an outside party can certainly help. So that brings us to our first poll question. And for those of you taking CPE, this is important. I'm certainly happy to get the CPE. We're running up on year end, and no one wants to be spending their holidays taking CPE. So make sure you answer these questions. How much has your organization discussed the IRA so far? A lot. We're ready to get started. B, we're a bit unsure how our organization can benefit from the IRA. C, heard about the law passing, but would like to learn more. So you do have a short period of time there to get those answers in, so please do so. And while you're answering, I believe we will continue on with the presentation. So that brings us to the most exciting, in my view, part of this legislation of the IRA. And for the first time ever, state and local tax exempt entities, governmental entities, can take advantage of tax credits that were previously only available to for-profit corporations. I guess there was a way to get tax credits if you worked with an outside for-profit company, but with this new legislation, cities and towns and can now and other local governmental entities and tax exempt entities can get direct payments from the federal government for the clean energy project. So this is really a game changer, in my view, where it was really difficult for governmental entities to take advantage of this. And if you think about it, governmental entities with no profit motive, with available funding to them from rural development, Department of Energy, tax exempt debt, ability to issue tax exempt debt on the capital markets, really should lead to a lower cost project if done themselves, rather than going through a for-profit company. So this really was an important piece, part of the legislation, and makes it available to all of you, most of you on the call here today. So who are the eligible entities for qualifying energy projects? Cities, towns, counties, municipal utilities, schools. You can see over here to the right, we have a listing of a lot of the eligible entities. Not all of them are governmental, or not-for-profit. Certainly, manufacturers continue to be able to take advantage of these credits. Local government, like we talked about, not-for-profits, colleges and universities are now eligible to get these direct payment, or the law allows for direct payment. We know, which we'll go over here in a minute, but it also allows for transfers of those credits or sale of those credits. So there's various ways to take advantage of that with financing your project. Housing, real estate, healthcare and life sciences, fuel and refineries, and certainly individual households. There's aspects of the IRA that benefit individual households. So, I mean, you think about it, we're talking tax credits and we're talking direct pay tax credits. And so if you have a project and you can get 30 to 50% of your project in tax credits, then, basically you're getting a grant for that, for that clean energy project. So it reduces the local funding and direct costs, which makes your project much more, cost effective. And really for projects that I know it's we all want to do right by the environment and do our clean energy projects, but a lot of times in the past those really just haven't made sense financially. Now with being able to get these tax credits and getting 30 to 50% of those qualifying projects paid for through tax credits, well, that likely bumps them up over into the positive range and makes your project, viable again. So it's really, if you're considering one, you certainly want to consider it. If you have one that's been in the queue, you may want to, halt. We're going to talk about timelines here in a minute, but in order to take advantage of the enhanced tax credits, that you have to wait until after. You can't complete your project till after January 1 of 23. So we're almost there now. I realize it's almost November, but you may want to reassess and see how you can take advantage of these new incentives. So the tax credits can get very complex. There's over 70 separate tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. 50 of those, Baker Tilly has experience with and working with. These tax credits have been around since the ARA days, back 2008, 2009, a lot of them. What the Inflation Reduction Act did is it enhanced and extended and those tax credits. So, in many of these credits and incentives are entitlements, meaning if your project qualifies for the meets specific criteria, you are entitled to the tax credit. There are some that are competitive and limited, but many of them are if you meet the requirements, you're eligible for the credit. So there is most of these credits are good through 2032, beginning as I said, in 2023. The law did restore and made retroactive the current incentives through the end of this year, through 2022. Beginning in 2023, the new credits with bonus criteria that we're going to talk about here in a minute go into effect. And then after 2025, there is a transition and allow for some of the more of a goal to just reduce carbon emissions with your projects. So how big is this piece of the act? What projects? Say I'm sitting in a local government seat or a not-for-profit corporation or university. What projects qualify? Well, I think the obvious ones are wind, solar, hydro. Those ones have been around and I think are easiest to conceptualize. Those solar projects, where you think about, you have governments have many large governmental buildings, and do we want to put solar on roof? Do you want to put solar in your parking lots? How can we, I think a lot of the projects we've seen so far that are utility projects, where you're either your public power, you're going to add on a solar project and solar infrastructure to carry a portion of your power load, or if you're a water or sewer utility that wants to install solar to offset the power costs in your sewer utility. With these new incentives, that becomes very, very cost effective. You have biomass, combined heat and power. We're going to have an example of combined heat and power coming up here. Geothermal, carbon capture, capturing the carbon before it goes out into the atmosphere. Electric vehicles, replacing gas vehicles or other vehicles with electric clean energy vehicles. Those are eligible. EV charging stations. And then renewable low carbon fuels are also included in the act and eligible for the incentives. One example would be biogas for wastewater treatment plants, and installing those, capturing the gas, and even cleaning it and putting it back into the system. There's all sorts of new technology that may be able to be taken advantage of, and to reduce the overall costs to run your utility. And of course, the costs are lower. That can help keep your utility rates more moderate. Other pieces of new credits that are included in the act. Qualifying biogas, and you see ITC here. What is that? I should have probably written those out, but it's an investment tax credit. Solar production tax credit is a new one. Sustainable aviation fuels, clean hydrogen production tax credit. Storage, say you have a public power utility and you want to store the electricity that you're making. That storage technology and batteries are eligible. Zero emissions nuclear, clean transportation fuels, energy efficiency construction, and clean energy manufacturing. Now, why do I include that here on this slide with advanced manufacturing production credit or advanced energy credit? Well, I mean, that could be a way of for economic development for your community. If you have if you're in a place where you can take advantage of the clean energy manufacturing, and they can come into your town and create jobs and revenues for your city or town. Electric vehicle infrastructure, and vehicles. So there's a lot here. What is investment tax credit? What is production tax credit? Well, there are two different types of credits that are allowed for in the Inflation Reduction Act. The investment tax credit means you get it not up front. The way these projects will work a lot is, you have to build the project, then likely there'll be a filing, with the federal government, and they'll pay directly for that project. So you can reduce the overall size of the financing, the long-term financing at that point, or the cost of the project, by getting that investment tax credit back. Or the production tax credit, which is credits based on the production over a 10-year period, 10 or 12-year period. How do you know what's best for your project? Well, that's all in the analysis of, which one might be best. And a lot of these, you can do one or the other. Certainly, the investment tax credit is, seems like a good idea. They both are. It really just depends on how much, what's the best financially for your project. So it is good to have options. So direct pay tax credits, and how do they work? What's provided in the legislation? Well, the overriding theme here is that you have a base credit and then you add on bonus criteria for your qualifying energy project. So really the base credit is 6% for qualifying energy projects. But if you meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, you multiply that times 5, and that's a 30% credit. I know, I think for, a lot of municipal entities or cities or towns, a lot of times that are meeting prevailing wage and requirements are already baked in. You're already doing that. So maybe that's not such a large lift for public entities. Or an important thing on timing is you meet begun construction requirements, which is a technical term, tax term, and the law lays out that if you meet the begun construction requirements within 59 or 60 days after the rules are produced by the federal government, that you are considered to have met those requirements, and basically you're automatically at the 30%. So that from a timing standpoint, if you have something in the queue or you're thinking about it, well, we're not sure how long it's going to take for the rules to come out. But assuming it's 3 months, another 59 days, you have 5 or 6 months to meet those requirements. And being in construction isn't actually being in construction, and it's but certainly we can help work through that. And then if you're buying domestic content, it's 10%, another 10%. So if you're basically buying American or meeting those requirements, there's another 10%. If you're in an energy community, what they consider an energy community, it's another 10%. And then environmental justice for solar and wind can be either 10 or 20% add-on. So you can see that these add-ons that start at about 30% can go to 60 or 70. I mean, that's extreme. I hate to even throw that out there because most won't probably get over 50%, but in extreme cases, you could get 70% of your eligible project cost paid for. But there is, you'll notice here, a deduct. And this is particularly important for governmental entities where if you do use tax-exempt funding, you get a 15% deduct. So, so that brings into the question, do we do tax-exempt? Do we do taxable financing? Again, that's where you need your financial consultants, municipal advisors to help you work through those questions and really, what's best for your project and your community. I think what's clear here is that there's significant ability to get these credits for your project, your clean energy projects, and certainly is worthwhile. But there is quite a bit of guidance that's needed here, and it is important to note that not all credits apply to all projects. So as we talked about, there's 70 of these and tax credits and incentives, and each one has their own rules. So you need to work through all that. Let's talk about the adders, the domestic content, the additional 10%. It's important to know that projects less than 1 megawatt, that you don't have to meet that. Basically, you get that 10% value, and then there is ability to enhance that. Basically, that starts at 2%, and you can enhance that by meeting the begun construction deadlines. Energy community. If you're in an energy, what is an energy community? It can be a brownfield, economies tied to coal, oil, or natural gas, locations where coal mines have closed since 1999 or coal power plants have closed since 2009. So that's some information, some summary information based on those two add-on incentives. The final add-on incentive we'll talk about here is environmental justice, and it can be met in a couple ways. You can either be located on Indian land that for projects up to 5 megawatts, or you can being an area where there's 50% of the economic benefit is to low to moderate income households. And this is for solar and wind capacity, and it is limited to 1,800 megawatts per year, allocated in 2023 and 2024. So you do this is limited, and you would so if you say you had 720 projects at 5 megawatt per project, that's how many projects would be eligible. So with that, I will turn it over to Gideon to go through some examples for you.
Thank you, Doug. We wanted to give just a few examples that we think would be very relevant to cities and towns, and that because often cities and towns or municipal utilities will own more often certain types of properties than others. And so we wanted to highlight a couple here. Doug talked a little bit about solar facilities, which we'll talk about in the next example, but many cities and towns will have combined heat and power property. So these are cogeneration units that might exist within city buildings or within a university central utility plant, for example, where you are creating electricity and also creating steam or hot water as part of an integrated energy facility. And so the combined heat and power investment tax credit has been around for a long time, but the Inflation Reduction Act increased the gravity of that credit and went from a 10% tax, a 10% credit for qualifying property to 30%. So it's much larger, and it also has the potential for additional adders like Doug talked about. So this is very relevant for a lot of cities and towns and universities and other nonprofits that may own cogeneration units within buildings, or if you have commercial properties that either you have in the town or trying to attract to your city and town. Things like hotels and casinos often have combined heat and power facilities for energy efficiency purposes as part of their design. And this is a real opportunity for a municipally owned or nonprofit entity owned CHP facility to be a lot more economic. So if you're thinking about whether you want to build a new property, a new cogeneration unit, this is a way to significantly reduce the payback period by getting either 30 or as much as 50% of the qualifying combined heat and power property paid back to you via direct pay for an investment tax credit. On the next page, Doug, if you could advance it. On the next page, we talk a little bit more about how direct pay would impact an example solar facility. So in this example, we're looking at a 1 megawatt solar facility, which is common for a pretty common size for a large building or a group of buildings that might have solar on the roof. And depending on where you are in the country, you'll have different solar capacity factors. So we're just assuming a 20% capacity factor, sort of a medium sunny place, not particularly sunny, but kind of average. And we assume, for example, that you might be looking at a power sale or savings rate of 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And so this just shows you a bit of a sensitivity table about how the payback period might be impacted positively now that public entities are able to take advantage of the investment tax credit. They can file for the tax credit on qualifying property, and then they would get the appropriate percentage back once from the federal government once the solar facility goes into service. So you can see it's a little hard to read, but you can see on the left is a cost basis. On the top is the rate of power. So obviously the higher the rate that you would normally get for the power, the more quickly the project pays off. And then the ITC amount on the far right, you see that at a 0% ITC level, which is up until the IRA, cities and towns of municipally owned solar were not eligible for the investment tax credit. There you would see a payback period in the best case of maybe 8 years, which may well be worth it. But as you then look to integrate the ITC investment tax credit under the new regime, you could get as much as $630,000 for a 40% ITC, $790,000 for a 50%, and so on. And so you can see that suddenly the payback period for a solar facility in that case gets much better very quickly. And in sort of the ultimate scenario where you might have a small power project on an Indian, put together by an Indian tribe on Indian land in a low-income community, sort of checking all of the boxes that the bonus adders Doug was talking about, you might see as much as a 60 or 70% ITC direct pay payment, which would significantly reduce the total capex of the project and make the payback period quite reasonable. So these are just an example of how you would think about the analysis, and this is the kind of stuff that we can help project developers or cities and towns think through if they're considering new projects.
That brings us to our next poll question. Number 2, do you currently have projects planned or in flight that you think may qualify for IRA tax credits? Those are pretty clear there, the answers. So if you would, if you're looking away or whatever, come back, especially if you need the CPE, and answer these questions. Now we'll turn it over to Dave Erdman. And I don't know, Dave, if you want to introduce yourself, since you may have some technical difficulties early on before you start with your portion.
Yes, thanks, Doug, and thanks, Gideon, for your comments so far. And yes, thanks for the introduction earlier. I was having some technology problems, the worst time to have them, but I am Dave Erdman. I'm a managing director here at Baker Tilly. I have just joined Baker Tilly after a 33-year career at the state of Wisconsin. So I'll be bringing some finance, timeline, and other consideration perspectives to the presentation today. One theme I'm hoping that people have heard by now is that this is a pretty complex program. You know, it's great for the public sector and, really levels the playing field, to provide tax credits and other financing that's available to public sectors compared to what's been in the private sector for many years. But there's a lot of complexities, and it's important for, public sector to engage the help that may be needed to outline, identify, the different variables that are in place here. Project details, Inflation Reduction Act provisions and options, tax law interpretations, declarations, and so forth. Many moving parts here. And as Doug mentioned, there's moving parts relative to energy projects, but it's also moving parts relative to other financing that currently is available from both the federal and state government. The Infrastructure Act, for one, how this funding relates to that is something that a municipal advisor can help clients identify, where's the best place to put the funds that are available to it. With respect to the Inflation Reduction Act, this can apply to entire projects or just small components of projects. Putting on my issuer hat from the days, at the state of Wisconsin where I was employed, we actually had energy production, and I could see how this could be really beneficial to some of the projects there related to the energy production that we had at campuses and other facilities. But wearing my local official hat, I can also see how this program can be beneficial, from everything from, utility projects like Doug mentioned, water treatment, wastewater treatment projects, to, new fire stations. There's different components to those projects which could be eligible for some of the tax credits that are available underneath the Inflation Reduction Act. In addition to reaching out and getting the help needed to identify the projects, timeliness is also something that's quite important. And we'll go through some of that in a little bit more detail coming up, but it's important to identify what tax credits might be applicable and to get in line. Not that the funding is going to be limited, but get in line to understand the timeline that might be there in order to maximize those credits. We've talked about how the Inflation Reduction Act kind of intertwines with other funding at the federal level. The other component that public sector should take into consideration is how does the tax credits for the Inflation Reduction Act relate to other state level programs, whether it be funding programs through a Department of Energy office within states. And every state is different, so we really can't address every situation in this webinar. But is there some assistance for a project through state funding? We've identified water and wastewater projects, and how does the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits and the funds that are available, through some of the other loan programs, which we'll talk about later, how does that relate to funding that you can get through your state revolving fund for your water and wastewater project that your Department of Natural Resources or other environmental organization in your state may have available. So what compounds this even more is that the Inflation Reduction Act actually puts more money into some of those federal programs through the Federal Department of Energy and the federal USDA. So understanding how these relate not only to the project aspects from the cost allocation standpoint, but also from the different timelines is important. The last thing I want to address on this slide is just ESG. And ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance factors. And ESG is something that's been growing substantially in both the private sector and the public sector over the recent years. Obviously, the types of projects that we're talking about here are projects that some communities may be looking at to help support sustainability plans they may have in their community. Renewable energy, clean energy, energy efficiency, and so forth might be some projects that communities are undertaking, and now there's some federal tax grants, federal tax credits, and others available to help with carrying out those projects. More importantly, part of the ESG is possibly designating a bond issue that relate to the project. This is what you may hear as green bonds or social bonds or climate bonds. Obviously, doing some of these projects would be prime candidates in order to be maybe designated, using either the Climate Bonds Initiative or the International Capital Markets Association criteria. And I just mentioned that because with the designated bond, the idea is that you can get a lower cost of capital. So it's kind of a win-win situation in the sense that you could have this project, portions of it could be eligible for from federal tax credits underneath the Inflation Reduction Act, and you could further possibly, designate the bond, for ESG considerations and get a lower cost of capital on that end. So just something else to keep in mind as you look forward to the different projects. On the next slide, we start to go into some of the details on the timelines. Doug did a good job of talking about the investment tax credits versus production tax credits. I think the key thing, two key things here is that the ITC is a one-time tax credit, which you'll get when the project is placed in the service, or you'll apply for when you place the project in service. The production tax credit is something you'll receive over time. And depending upon which tax credit is best is part of the analysis that municipal advisor can help you complete as you look at the options in front of you. With respect to the tax credits, some are available for both. Some are only available for the ITC. Some are only available for the PTC. So understand which tax credit is the best for your project is also part of the equation here. Doug talked about some of the add-ons that are available for the ITC. Most of those components are available right now, but some components, such as the low-income communities, the Native American Indian land tax credits, are subject to an allocation of annual limits by the Treasury Department. So understanding the criteria as to those adders also impacts the analysis that will be needed to determine whether an ITC or a PTC should be pursued. We use the term also, second item I want to highlight on this particular topic is direct pay tax credits. Direct pay means that you as the public sector are going to apply and receive the tax credit. Some of these tax credits are set up so they're transferable. Again, case-by-case review needed. But when I say transferable, that means that the tax credit could maybe be sold or securitized to a third party. Again, something that may be beneficial, may not be beneficial. It's part of the analysis that would be completed by a municipal advisor. As we look at the timeline, there's three kinds of projects that I want to address quickly that all kind of relate to this begun construction and being placed in the service after calendar year 2022. Current projects is one component. If you have a project you're currently undertaking, there's a question in the chat about a wastewater treatment project in somewhere in Wisconsin. That's one example. I'm going to talk about another project here in a little bit, but if you have a project that's currently under construction, to the extent that it's not going to be placed into service until after January 1 of 23, your project may have components that would be eligible for some of the tax credits that we've been addressing. Obviously, working with your consultant to identify if any components of the project that would be eligible and the steps needed to make sure that you meet the place into service requirement would be important for current projects. I mentioned the wastewater treatment plant project that's in the questions. I'm also aware of a new fire department, or a new fire building that local fire department's building. Shovels were in the ground or began construction last year, but it's not going to be completed until next year. This new fire station has geothermal, it has solar panels. A key project that would be eligible for some federal tax credits based upon an assessment to make sure that what tax credit would be best and what cost allocations could be done in order to maximize that. If you have some pending projects, Doug mentioned the begun construction component and how there are certain multipliers that could be met. The prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement, that if you have a construction that is ready to begun construction within 59 days after the regulations being finalized, you can get those bonus criteria without actually meeting the bonus criteria standards. So having a project and getting it to the point where it's ready for begun construction could also be helpful. As for future projects, obviously the regulations are there now. The ITC and the PTC funding is there now. Obviously, no one can speak for what future funding will be for these projects going forward. And furthermore, there's some provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that would diminish some of the credits in the future. So working with a consultant to determine what kind of penalty or drag may be out there in the future relative to a funding timeline now is also something that could be helpful. With respect to tax credits, many on the webinar here are probably public officials that have said, federal tax credits. I've heard about this before. Back in 2009, 2010, I issued some Build America bonds where the federal government promised to pay me 35% of my interest on taxable bonds that I issued. And lo and behold, 3-4 years after I issued those bonds, sequestration kicked in and I wasn't given the 35% by the federal government. It dropped down to as low as 27, 28%. There are provisions actually and approaches in the Inflation Reduction Act in order to provide some safeguard there. It's not totally sequestration proof, but what they've done is, while these are called federal tax credits, in the legislation, they're made to look more like rebates, which wouldn't be subject to the sequestration provisions that have been used in the past. So there should be some comfort, hopefully, in the Inflation Reduction Act that the bad taste that some issuers have in their mouth from prior tax credits being reduced would not occur for the Inflation Reduction Act. On the next slide, I want to talk about taxable versus tax-exempt financing. And in the explanation of the federal tax credits, there was the discussion about how there would be a deduct of 15% if you used tax-exempt financing for the overall project. People are probably asking, well, why would that be? Well, obviously, the federal government is taking into consideration that if you're using tax-exempt financing for the project, the federal government's already given you a subsidy with that tax exemption. So that's the reason why they're reducing it by 15% for tax-exempt financing. Obviously, working with your municipal advisor, you can quickly determine which is the best route, if I should do taxable financing and get the full tax credit, or do tax-exempt financing and lose that 15%. Obviously, different markets, different interest rate environments would drive as to how that analysis comes out. With respect to the intention here, or the perceived intention of maybe forcing more financings through the taxable range, there's already been some discussion and some research being done and floated as to how the Inflation Reduction Act could be a game changer for public sectors, not only from the tax credits that it provides, but maybe reducing the importance or reliance of tax-exempt financing for governments. I personally don't think that's a concern. Obviously, there's tax-exempt financing for energy projects, but there's still going to be a lot of tax-exempt financing out there for road projects and other needs of communities. So I don't think people should be concerned about the Inflation Reduction Act potentially impacting how tax-exempt financing in general applies to projects that are going on. Other considerations when you're looking at taxable versus tax-exempt options is that it may just be best to do a taxable financing for other reasons. There's some issuers that do taxable financing now, so they don't have to complete a federal tax law review. There may be components of this project that don't meet a federal tax review and have to be taxable in the first place. Smaller issuers are looking at bank qualified and managing their bank qualified provisions. Doing a taxable financing maybe is a way to get around some of the bank qualified limitations that might be out there. So different variables here that a municipal advisor would work with you to determine what would be the best structure to not only take advantage of the best tax credit for the project underneath the Inflation Reduction Act, but also position your municipality in a good position going forward for other financings. Last thing I want to highlight about tax credits in the public sector is that 15% is the reduction for if you do tax-exempt financing. There's also another 15% that floats around the Inflation Reduction Act. And how this act is paid for, in part, is a new alternative minimum tax that is 15% that's assessed on people that are subject to AMT a 15% assessment on the adjusted financial statement income. I just mentioned it. That's how the program is funded. It has no impact as to the tax credits, but just want to mention that's an 15% component. Some people may hear about when they talk about the act. On the next slide, going to go into a little bit more detail as to timing. Essentially, you receive these federal tax credits when the project is placed into service. Begun construction and placed into service are a couple buzzwords that you should definitely work your consultant with to have a better understanding. You apply for the tax credit, again, the year the project is placed into service. Guidance is still expected to be coming out as to how you would apply for these tax credits. A lot of people on the phone or on the webinar today probably have not filed a tax return in the past. So what's going to be required for public entities to receive these tax credits? We've talked about regulations coming out. The Treasury Department actually back on October 5th put out a request for comment on different components of the Inflation Reduction Act. They're taking comments until November 4th. This process about claiming the tax credit might be something that would be a good area for public entities to provide a comment on, so that the process to receive this tax credit could be as easy as possible without a lot of paperwork in order to receive that. With respect to how you pay for the cost, it's another area that the municipal advisor will be able to help you with. You're going to have to pay for the costs as you incur them, with the idea that you're going to get the tax credit after the project's completed. As to when the project is completed, that's going to drive when you're going to receive the funds. So that's a timeline consideration. But what do you use for your funds in order to pay for the project until those funds are available? Obviously, interim financing is an option depending upon the size of the project. Structuring your financing so that you have some flexibility of part of the financing to pay off some of the financing is also an alternative. Or if it's going to be a smaller amount, just using internal funds or reimbursing yourself once you receive proceeds from the tax credit. If you are going to go the reimbursement route, work with your bond counsel to make sure you have everything in place. These will not be the proceeds of taxes on bonds, so a declaration of intent underneath the Department of Treasury regulations most likely is not needed. But it's still a good safeguard to just have that declaration of intent in place in case something happens. With respect to receipt of the tax credit funds, this is an area that's still being looked at, but it's not necessarily restricted to the project. In other words, if you did a financing and did a project and applied for the tax credit and received those funds, there's a potential you could use that for other purposes. Again, something to discuss with your municipal advisor and with your bond counsel to make sure you're not tripping up eligibility for the funds or other tax law matters. Running a little bit short on time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the next slide other than to highlight that there's many programs out there through the Department of Energy and the Department or USDA that not only will help public sector, but also some of these programs will be able to help manufacturing and other entities in your community. Doug mentioned it earlier about how we're highlighting how the Inflation Reduction Act can help public sector, not directly but indirectly through how it may be able to help with economic development through catalysts that's available for different private areas. With respect to the USDA, a lot of people understand their loan programs because many communities will use or consider USDA financing with respect to water and wastewater projects. The next two slides are just kind of key recommendations that we have as a result of this webinar. I think if you haven't heard it once, you've heard it many, many times, that the key part is that it's important to reach out and to engage a consultant to help you walk through this difficult process. 70 different tax credits. It's just not one tax credit. And every tax credit has its own requirements, own timelines, own provisions. Yes, it's been said by many people that the Inflation Reduction Act represents the most significant legislation to invest in clean energy and address climate change in our nation's history. But with that opportunity does come some requirements that requires good planning to address everything that's involved with your projects. On the next page, there's some recommendations here. I'm not going to go through them directly, but the key thing is to reach out, engage the help that's needed. And then on the next page, we talk about, understanding some of the key phrases here about beginning construction, placed in the service, working with a consultant to see if you have a project that's currently underway, ways for you to still realize some of the tax credits that are available underneath the Inflation Reduction Act. And likewise, the final thing on this page is just working with your municipal advisor or others to see how these projects can interrelate benefit, maximize, leverage any efforts that you have with respect to ESG efforts or sustainability efforts within your community. And with that, I believe we're back to our final poll question, which is appearing on your screen right now. And it's a simple question as to would you like to meet to discuss your project or other IRA considerations? So with that, I'll turn it back over to Doug to maybe help organize some questions and answers that came in during the presentation.
Thank you, Dave. Nice job on that. Just a couple of additional topics to touch on. I don't think we talked about if you're doing a project and the project is not fully a clean energy project, there can be certain aspects within that project that would qualify as clean energy projects, and could be, you could have the ability to get some the tax credits to finance a portion of that project. So there can be pieces within projects that can qualify for these tax credits. And we talked a lot about tax exempt and taxable financing, and there are certainly a lot of ways to finance these projects, and some of these projects may be small enough that you pay for with cash, and you get the tax credits back, and you're able to do that without financing. But certainly, I think interim financing will be likely required, or long-term upfront, and take the tax credit, direct pay tax credits after the fact. With that, I think we're running right up on it. I do think we've got quite a few questions.
Hey, Doug, this is Gideon. If you don't mind, there were a number of questions that I can address kind of in lump sum, which is a number of questions asked about if there was already a project that was put into service prior to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, or prior to 2023, can those projects be eligible for some of the incentives? In general, we can look at each project specifically to give a specific answer. But in general, the idea behind the incentives is to produce additionality. So the law and the incentives are designed to incentivize new projects. So projects that have already been successfully put into place and funded are generally not eligible for things like the production tax credit if they're already in service. If they're still under construction and have not yet been placed in service, there may be situations where those projects may be eligible for some incentives. But if a project, for example, was designed and constructed and implemented into service in 2021, for example, I don't believe you would have much opportunity to take advantage of, for example, the solar production tax credit, because the idea is that they're trying to increase the number of projects, not just support projects that may already be in production. And that goes for the other types of qualifying property as well.
Okay. A lot of these questions will be. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my other screen. Will be, based on the rules that will come out. Just like we all were aware when the Infrastructure Act came out. There's still rules coming out there. When the American Rescue Plan came out, the rules came out after the fact, and hopefully that these rules will come out quickly. A lot of these more specific questions would likely need some more guidance on that. But as we talked about, we have our firm has a lot of experience with these tax credits and have a good understanding of how they work, and can certainly help you on your projects. So with that, we are right up at an hour, to the extent we can, we'll get back to you on your questions with responses later. And certainly appreciate everyone taking the time to be with us today, and to learn more about the Inflation Reduction Act and how it can help your communities and ultimately your citizens of your communities. So with that, I'll say goodbye and have a good afternoon. And thank you, Dave, and thank you, Gideon, for all your insight and presentations.
Thanks, everybody, for attending.
Thanks for coming. Take care.